Hello, chess friends, and welcome to Zarov's Chess channel, and welcome to my Basics in Chess series. So, in this series, we're following opening principles, middle game strategies, and the endgame strategies. Today, we'll talk about some defensive strategies again. Today, we'll talk about the queen problems that can happen to you in the middle game or in an early stage of the game in the opening. Because sometimes in chess, you have a great activity with your minor pieces. You haven't made mistakes. You have a great activity with bishops. You have a great activity with knights. You have an even great activity with the rooks, but you cannot really find a way where to go with the queen, what to do with the queen, because the queen is maybe a little bit endangered. The queen is maybe on the d file, and your opponent has placed the rook on the d file. You cannot find good squares for the queen. The queen has sort of a lack of squares. So what you do then? In order to make something happen in this game, you should really try to first solve the problems of the queen, because even if the queen is placed on a weird place, it will always find a way into the game, because the queen, first of all, is a long range piece, but it's also a flexible piece. So the queen will find a way into the game. Don't worry about that. First, you should solve this defensive problems of the queen, and then if the position clears, then maybe it's time to strike with the queen. What should we do when we have the queen troubles? You should first of all get the queen on a closed file. So it means when the rook is of course on the d file, get out of the d file, because if the position on the d file opens somehow, then you could have troubles with your queen. One other strategy can be to play with the queen on the same file like your opponent's queen, because you're basically following the queen. If the queen is on the c file, you should always also place your queen on c file, because then your queen cannot be attacked by some rooks or similar ideas. So one of the third defensive strategies in order to solve the problems of the queen is to search really a good square for the queen. But sometimes it's hard to find that square, and we had all of these troubles, I think. But this square can be really a weird square. Maybe this square can be an a3 square, where we shouldn't basically play with the queen. Maybe the square will be an h8 square or similar square that we're not used to play with the queen. But as I said, first we solve these problems of the queen. Maybe we place it even on a weird square, but then when the position activates, when we activate the minor pieces, the queen, I promise you, will find a way into the game. In order to show you and explain you this idea more, I've prepared three examples. Here's first one of my games in which I think I have a good activity here with my pieces, but I don't have a good activity with the queen. I would love to play something like queen to a5, even trade off the queens, because then I would solve the problems of the queen and will continue the game with the huge activity with my minor pieces. But so far, queen to a5 is not possible, because my opponent threatens to play bishop takes c6, and if I take the queen, he'll simply take the queen and will have an extra piece. What I also don't like is to develop the queen on d7, because then it's obvious that my opponent would try something like rook to d1, and I'll stay with my queen on the same file like the rook, and there could be some tactical problems with potential c5 moves. What I also don't like is to move queen to c7, because I don't like that move, because this move allows maybe white to make sort of a move knight to b5. Then I'm again vulnerable to my opponent's attacks. So where to go with the queen? The queen in this particular position I decided to place on c8, because first of all, it's a weird square. It's most of the times you will not play the move queen to c8, and it's obvious that the queen shouldn't stay on this square for a while. But at least I think I have solved now the problems of the queen for a while, because the queen cannot be attacked by the rook on the c file, because still white needs many moves. He needs one bishop move, one knight move, or maybe a pawn move in order to develop, still to make something happen with this knight, and still remove the pawn somewhere. So he'll need at least, I think, like 5-6 tempos. And I decided to place the queen on the same diagonal like the bishop, because I'm threatening the move bishop to h3. So I can maybe trade off the light square bishop and go something like knight to g4, maybe even create checkmate threats. But that's in long terms, that's I think too optimistic to think that I'm gonna checkmate. But at least I think I have solved the problems of the queen now. And even some other moves like e4, I'm not worried about these moves because I will simply play something like bishop to d7 and maybe play a discovered attack on the queen on a4. So that's why, as I said, I solved first this problem and waited now my opponent what to do, because I still have a good activity with my pieces. I'm not worried about the minor pieces. Maybe in some occasions I could also try e6 b5 ideas, but so far it's not possible because of this diagonal of the bishop. But as a minority attack idea, it could maybe work, but still we'll see what my opponent will play. And in the game, my opponent tried to move knight to d5. He has now, of course, the opportunity to recapture with a pawn and will have a great activity. But now I decided simply to take. You see, the activity of my pieces allowed me to play in this style, because now I have knight to d4. I'm attacking, of course, the e2 pawn. My opponent tried e4, bishop to d7. After queen to d1, you see I kicked away his queen, because his queen suddenly became an object of my attack. He played too early with the queen, and now after bishop to b5, I have the fork on c2. Here I want to stop. It's not about showing this game further. It's about how the queen can be activated even on a weird square like c8, because the queen is supposed to play sometimes on c2, maybe c7, b6, maybe a5. So you should really search for great activities, but in this particular example it wasn't possible, so that's why queen to c8 perfectly fine. So I wanted to show you another maneuver which was played recently. It was a game played by Magnus Carlsen against Jeffrey Young. Here Jeffrey Young found really a great maneuver and applied this idea to stay with the queen on the same file like his opponent's queen. So he has to stay with the queen on the d file, but here he'll try another maneuver in order to keep his rook connection. I'll explain, of course, what's all about. So here, after the move bishop to e3, Jeffrey Young castling, also played by Magnus, and now d6, rook to c1, and now we have knight to d7. So far Jeffrey Young has sort of a trouble that Magnus Carlsen's rook is on the c file. So if the position clears somehow on the c file, this could be a problematic thing. Then the queen could be vulnerable to white's attack. So that's why here Magnus tried b4, but now rook to c8. This is now sort of a queen rook maneuver, in which after king to h1, here Jeffrey Young played the queen on the starting square on d8, but still has a good position. I think he kept his queen on the same file like Magnus Carlsen's queen. So if now, for instance, the position clears somehow, you see the only thing that is tricky here, that will probably trade off the queens on the d file, which is of course good. We were not vulnerable to our rook attacks anymore, and still we're continuing the game with a rook competition sort of on c file. So again, if something clears, still we have a great activity, and we can maybe trade off the rooks on the c file. So you see, this maneuver was very good, I think, by Jeffrey Young. So rook to c8, and then queen to d8. Now I think he has at least solved for a while his positional problems, and now it's time to play. So here Magnus tried knight to b3 and knight to e5, knight to a4. I've analyzed this game on my YouTube chess channel. I'm not going to show you now all of these possible tactics, but here after knight to d7, queen to d4, and b5 played by Jeffrey Young, you see how important it was to keep his rook connection here between these two rooks and still have a good activity with his queen. If something again clears, then we'll simply again trade off the queen. So in the game, knight to f5, knight to c6 played by Jeffrey, and here after bishop takes c6 and bishop takes b5, here Jeffrey Young had a comfortable game and won the game eventually. So I'm not going to show you the whole game. I just wanted to show you again, it was sort of a weird square for the queen, because we have already played with the queen, but got back on the starting square, and this was all necessary because Magnus Carlsen played on this queenside pawn storm. He has activated his rook on the c file, so there were some tactical threats, and here I think Jeffrey Young solved them very easily. So let's see now another example. Here is a game played by young Christoph Duda against Vasily Ivanchuk. Here, young Christoph Duda has played early with the queen, and of course, when you make that kind of moves, it's obvious that your opponent will try to attack the queen. In the game d4 played by Duda, bishop to g7, bishop to f4, bishop to e6, attacking the queen. And most of us would retreat probably to c2 or d1. Here, young Christoph Duda plays first the move queen to a3 because this queen is not vulnerable to your opponent's attacks anymore. He calculated this very well because knight to c4 could be a possibility, but now after queen to a4, you see we have attacked the knight. If queen to d7 happens, now it's maybe time to play queen to c2 or even trade off the queens, but now at least we would have a central pawn storm here in which we could maybe pass through here with the move d5 and kick away the bishop. So you see queen to d7 is of course taking also this very important square for the bishop, so it's sort of a crowded situation here. So that's why here in the game after the move queen to a3, here Vasily Ivanchuk simply castled, and after e3 you see we have a new position in which white has of course this very nice center. So white has these two centralized pawns, still has a great activity. You see the knights are on very active squares, this bishop is also a very active diagonal, and also this bishop. So far we have a great minor piece activity, but we have only the problems of the queen. And I'm not going to show you again the whole game. I just wanted to point you out, even if this queen is on a weird square on a3, still this queen will find a way into the game. But at least we have solved the problems for a while now. We have a great activity with the pieces. And in the game here after knight to d7, here rook to d1, you see how young Christoph Duda plays now on this idea to play on this endangered queen situation, because now if the c file the d file opens with potential c5 moves, then suddenly black's queen is a little bit defensive here and has to make some moves, has to retreat somewhere. So in the game c6 was played, and knight to g5, we have bishop to f5, e4 kicking away, and now bishop to e2 after trades of bishops. Here I don't want to again show you all of these possible tactics. I wanted to show you how the queen can get into the game even if it's on a weird square on a3. So here in the game queen to e8 was played, and now queen to h3, we have even a checkmate threat. So you see young Christoph Duda solved first his positional problems. He retreated with the queen on a weird square in a3, but now transposes the queen to h3 and has now a great attacking possibility. So here I will stop. As I said, it's not about now showing you tactics, what would happen if that happens. I wanted to point you out that it's very necessary to develop the queen, of course, but develop it somewhere where it's not vulnerable to your opponent's attacks. Maybe it's on a weird square, but at least, as I said, you have solved the problems, and it's trying maybe to activate some other pieces. You see here Vasily Ivanchuk has also to play with the queen on a weird square on e8. Probably we would love to play maybe with the queen to a5, but so far it's not possible. So that's why here I think young Christoph Duda had really a comfortable game and won the game eventually against such a strong opponent like Vasily Ivanchuk. Okay, I hope that you realize these ideas. Don't panic when you don't have maybe good squares for the queen. Move it somewhere. Don't get the queen attacked. Don't allow your opponent that he's attacking you. Don't allow this queen to be really an object of your opponent's attack. When the position clears, the queen, as I said, will find a way into the game. Don't be scared. It's not about time to panic. It's about to strike back with some minor piece activity. So, okay, I hope that you realize these ideas, and I hope that you enjoyed this video. Meanwhile, you can watch my other basics in chess videos from the series. Here is the link with some more opening principles, middle game strategies, and the end game strategies. And you can also watch my previous analyzed videos with our defensive strategies. Here's also the link, and you can also subscribe to my channel if you like this content. Thank you for watching, guys, and chess is the best, of course.